What does it take to million fossils? First of all, I'm going to tell a little story. In the 1990s, Dr. Buchheim, one of our other geologists, and I were doing research in Wyoming. He studied the Green River Formation, and I studied the Bridger Formation nearby. And we'd spend part of our time together. And Fossil Butte National Monument hired a new park paleontologist. And to let her get acquainted with the area, they let her spend the first summer working with us. So she spent the whole summer with Buchheim and I, and Buchheim and I would work part of the time together and part of the time separate. And she was apparently from a Christian background, but she had every now and then jokes about creationists. So we learned from Dr. Roth, our department chair at the time, don't hassle people. If you disagree with them, if you don't agree with their evolution, treat them with kindness and respect. And so we did that with her. We didn't bother her about her jokes. But as the middle of the summer, Buchheim and Rachel and a couple of students went to some paleo meetings for a few days. And she started asking questions. She asked Dr. Buchheim, "Do you people believe in human evolution?" And he said, "No." Asked a few other questions. And we noticed her jokes about creation stopped. She got to know what kind of research we do and the papers we're publishing, and I think she came to respect what we're doing. And her attitude changed. She made a comment later, "I think there's a reason why I met you people." And she even thought about coming to Loma Linda for a PhD. We didn't have what she needed, but anyway, she thought about it. She's been a friend through the years. Well, last week, Chris and I were in South Dakota, and we stopped by Badlands National Park. And the visitor center, and they have this typical dioramas showing the different environments that the animals lived in over the millions of years. But Chris noticed that their displays were different than you would typically find. Instead of finding long descriptions of how all these animals evolved, they just had more simple, plain, gentle language. These animals adapted to the environment they were in, and things like that. They had a park paleontologist who's recently retired, been there 25 or 30 years, and must have had a big influence on those displays. So maybe we had a small influence on one national park at least. Okay, what does it take to make 1 million fossils? I think to a certain extent we know the answer, but I've found that getting acquainted much better with the kind of fossils we have, it makes a much greater impression of what it really does take to make fossils. So let's take a look at it. I find that the fossil record has sort of two groups of fossils, you could say. There are fossils very fragmentary and scattered, and then there's a wonderfully complete and exquisitely preserved aspect of the fossil record. Okay, we can see how things happen out there now, and the fragmentary and scattered, that's what we'd expect. That's just what would normally be there. But the wonderfully complete and exquisitely preserved part, as I'm going to try to show you, is an enigma for most geologists. How could that be? So the fragmentary and scattered part, those broken up bones, that's what you'd expect. So that's not surprising. The other part is an enigma. The modern world, there are very efficient processes that break down dead things, and so the earth does not get covered with rotting animals. Those things get recycled and feed into the strength of the next cycle. But category 2 fossils, the wonderfully complete ones, they require a break in the recycling process, a distinct break. And that's what I'm finding is very interesting. Another aspect of the fossil record that feeds in here. Here we have the geologic column, and at the bottom of the Precambrian, the bottom of the Pleistocene, there's a distinct break in the fossil record. Above that fossil record, you find fossils only in unique kind of situations, like traps that catch them, and I'll show you some examples. You don't find fossils forming in the normal way that we find in the rest of the fossil record. Okay, below the Pleistocene, I call the primary fossil record, fossils are all in water deposit sediments, but not in the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene is different. Okay, so what's going on there? I think that's very important. Okay, Pleistocene. The sites are the way fossils form in these Pleistocene sites is like fossils in the modern world. La Brea tar pits. That's just tar pits. Animals get stuck in there and they sink and get preserved. That happens still today. There's no mammoths around, but they have rabbits and things can fall in, get preserved. And when I go there, I kind of try to stay out of the tar. In the Arctic areas, they have crevasses in the ice. Animals can fall in there and get frozen and preserved. In Europe, there are acidic peat bogs, and there have been a few people who've fallen in the last few thousand years, and you find them beautifully preserved. Okay, so that's how fossils form today in the Pleistocene, in these unique situations. Okay, what do we have below the Pleistocene? This, the fossils below the Pleistocene form in these kind of rocks, the typical geologic column, those rocks. And so it's very different from the Pleistocene. And so what is the fossil record really like? And this is, I think we basically know what it takes to make fossils. But I don't think we're really, the implications of what it means, the significant, it hits us until, for me, until I've spent some years at the Tucson Fossil and Mineral Show in Arizona. If you've never been there, you ought to go. It occurs every year, 1st of February. Fossil dealers from around the world come with their wonderful fossils and sell them to you. If you go there, you can be frustrated unless you have a lot of money to buy some of these things. So anyway, and we see a part of the fossil record that most of us never really see, I think. So let's look at some examples. Trilobites. There's innumerable different kinds of fancy trilobites, beautifully preserved. And this one, it's from a place in New York. The legs, the soft tissues, the legs and the antennae are preserved, along with the hard parts. Dragonfly, perfectly preserved. Okay, how does that happen? Another soft-bodied animal, and then big crocodiles, and we'll talk more about some of those after a bit. So they're just amazing fossil record out there, which, like I say, most of us never see. More soft-bodied animals and those fish, and here you have a complete Paleozoic reptile, every bone in place. Of course, there are plenty of dinosaurs. Some of them are disarticulated and fragmentary. Others are complete, like this one. Complete and beautifully preserved. These creatures with their bones all in place, and there are a lot of things like that. This one hangs on my office, 3 feet long, every bone in place. This one, a fish from the Santana Formation in Brazil. The animals in that formation are preserved in 3 dimensions. And I have a paper by a taphonomist who studied these, and he concludes that the fossilization, the mineralization must have begun within hours after the animal died, maybe even before he was totally died. Amazing fossils. There's so many of them. This guy, complete, and look at the quality of the bones. They're just beautiful. Okay, today, what happens when animals die? Okay, the recycling system very effectively keeps the earth from being covered with rotting flesh. They rot and are recycled into the ecosystem, so you have bacteria, predators, scavengers. They do the job on these animals, and you just don't, they don't get preserved. Here's an example from Africa. Wildebeest live there by the millions. Probably too many for the ecosystem, I think. They have to make long voyages, long trips to find enough food, and they often have to cross rivers, which are sometimes swift and dangerous, and you have a lot of dead wildebeest every year. Some years they've had 10,000 dead wildebeest because of this. They drown trying to cross rivers, and they die. So 10,000 carcasses in a year. And then the bison. Okay, the one on the right there is a bison in this country. They used to be in the plains by the millions. Europeans with their guns have pretty well wiped them all out, except for in protected areas. And before that, for several thousand years, I suppose, Native Americans have been killing them for food and other resources. So, between wildebeest and bisons, there should be a great fossil record, right? Well, with these wildebeest, there are people who have studied that carefully. The wildebeest bones are all gone in 7 years. Okay, so, and that's just when the last bone is gone. The bones, the animal gets recycled by the predators and the scavengers, the crocodiles, etc. The bones gradually break down from chemical and physical processes until they're gone. 7 years. Bison, if you dig in riverbanks, you can find a few bones, a few skulls, but it's very rare to have bison bones that are even potential fossils. Okay, so no, you don't have a fossil record from all these animals. Okay, so contrast those animals with the fossil record. And we'll look again at some examples. This next group will be from a specific formation, the Green River Formation in Wyoming. And this formation is very thick, and I don't remember exactly how many million years it's supposed to have covered, but many millions of years. And most of it is very thin laminations, a tenth of a millimeter or so for each layer, each lamination. And if you accept the radiometric dating scheme, those layers had to be like one to a few layers per year. You know, so that thick per year. Okay, so what kind of fossils do we find there? Well, here's some typical Green River Formation fossils. You see that fish on the left? The turtles are up to, maybe 10 feet long or so, beautifully, every bone in place. This crocodile, I don't know how long that is, maybe there are some up to 14 feet. Again, every bone in place. That's the way it is in the Green River Formation. Here's an Eocene horse. We have a cast of one of these in our department. The oldest known fossil bat. Again, every bone in place. Where are the scavengers? These are fly larvae. So they're about that long, each one. Fly larvae perfectly preserved. How does that happen? The fish are the most famous, of course. There are literally many millions of fish, and most of them are preserved like that. There are some that are a little partially disarticulated, but still in place. But they're just wonderfully preserved. Plants, again, exquisitely preserved. Here's one of my favorite fossils. This one sits on my desk in my office. Coprolite. And you know what coprolites are? That's fossil poop. Okay, crocodile. And this thing, the picture on the right is a cross-section. And you have all these little laminations. They're like this. And they're tiny laminations. This thing was covered by 180 laminations. I counted them under a microscope. Okay, one or a few per year. They used to be explained as varves, which are layers formed by a specific process that makes one per year. Well, our own geologist, Paul Buchheim, did research that demonstrated that's not right. They're not that process. They're not varves, but they still, the time scale, radiometric time scale would indicate one to a few per year. Okay, 180. Did that thing lay on the bottom of a lake for a century and still look like that? That's what the usual explanation requires. What the radiometric time scale would indicate. There's no way. I mean, that thing would be destroyed, damaged in the bottom of a lake in a few days by animals and currents and all the rest, bacteria. A century? Not a chance. And there are quite a few of those. There are again millions of fish coprolites, and you see they're much smaller. Again, beautifully preserved. Actually, Dr. Buchheim did an interesting study on these. Like I say, they're by the millions, but yet if you figure the time scale, if a few of these layers are 1 year, and they did a quarry where they have known volume of sediment, and they know how many fish there are, and he estimated how many, if it took that as long as it's claimed, what does that tell us about the coprolites in the fish? His conclusion was you have some seriously, the fish were seriously impacted. They were not, there was just way too few of these. But anyway, there's probably a reasonable number for the fish if they were buried rapidly. And so they weren't constipated. But again, time. How do you, if there's time, it just doesn't work. Okay, let's look again some more things about predators, scavengers, and bacteria. They are such important parts of the recycling process. So a couple of examples. Up there in Wyoming, that cow made a serious mistake. Tried to cross a cattle guard. Got stuck. And within a few weeks, the insects removed the flesh inside, and you still have bones and skin. Another year, he looks like this, and then as time goes on, all the processes involved there destroy the thing until you have just a few scattered bones around, and then they'll disappear. And the bones in the way towards disappearing, they get to looking like this. The physical and chemical processes just deteriorate the bones until they disappear, like those wildebeest bones. Here's a couple of more examples. These are from Africa, where there's a lot of large animals, a lot of large mammals. And what happens to them? Well, this guy knows what happens to them. In a very short time, the flesh is gone. And then the other processes start to working, and before a terribly long time, I don't know if anybody's studied this and quantified it, but we know about the wildebeest. The bones are gone in 7 years, and it may take a little longer with these. They're they're up on dry land, but they don't last. They don't lay around. All right, let's look at some more fossils. I'm taking the risk here of overloading you with too much information that you could take in at one time. But I just want to make it very clear what kind of fossil record we have. And you again look at these things. This is a study we were doing in Peru. Thousands of whales that are articulated. Okay, how does that happen? When we got there, the literature from geologists who've been studying this and paleontologists all assumed that these sediments that are the diatom skeletons and sand that bury them, that came in like it does today in the ocean. That stuff accumulates on the bottom of the ocean a few centimeters per 1,000 years. And this was assumed to be what happens here. You bury them a few centimeters per 1,000 years. Well, there are people who study taphonomy of whales just off our coast here. When a big whale dies, he lands on the bottom of the ocean. How long would it take, do you think, for him to be gone? Thousands of creatures land on that whale and begin to eat. The flesh is gone in maybe 6 months. The bones are gone in a few years. Okay, if it's sediments coming in this much 1,000 years, Maybe it take 10 years to bury a whale, maybe 20 years. 10,000 years to bury a whale. They're gone in a few years. It just doesn't work. The time scale that the radiometrics give us just does not work. That one up there, you look at the bones, they're just exquisitely preserved. You don't find any evidence of destruction of those bones. With the whales, the scavengers eat the flesh, then they start working on the bones, boring holes in the bones, and we don't have any of that kind of boring in these whales. And what about that one? I mean, there's no destruction at all to those bones. Here you have a pretty large fish. He's all there, beautifully preserved, and the same with this one. Little fish, these are only guys about that big, and they're exquisitely preserved. There's a flea. I mean, a soft-bodied animal, beautifully preserved, like these insect larvae. There are quite a few fossil crabs, and they look like this, typically. They're just wonderfully preserved. How does that happen?
The bottom left is actually three-dimensional, right?
It looks like it, yeah.
It looks like Santana.
I don't know if it is or not. I think it isn't, but yet it's preserved much the same way. Okay, go back to Tucson and look at some more things. Individual fossils that I've been showing, that's only the beginning of the picture. There are amazing accumulations of large numbers of one or a few species in a concentrated mass death assemblage. We have an example of this in our office, a variety of types of mollusks, ammonites. All these trilobites, there's lots of accumulations of trilobites, typically one or two species. Okay, so we could ask, well, do these then represent a particular habitat that's gotten covered? Not really. You go out on the ocean or into a lake and you study what's on the surface there. You don't find one kind of animal. These do not represent living habitats. They are transported assemblages. So how did they get like this? And go to the next picture here. How do they get like this? And I would say this has to be by flowing water. Water, especially if it's rapidly flowing, it has a great ability to sort animals by size, shape, and other things. Flowing water just is amazing. We did our research in Peru near the town of Ica. Ica is a town right near the base of the Andes. And in that desert around there, there's no water, no rain. I've seen a figure of 1 millimeter per year on average. The water is the rivers that come out of the Andes. Okay, there's a river that comes through Ica. And Ica is an interesting town. There are lots of taxis. Everywhere there are taxis. And many of the taxis are a type they call ticos. It's a very little car. The back end of the car ends right behind the back seats and the back wheels. These little ticos are all everywhere. Okay, when this flood came through, it left a couple of feet of mud through the town. And again, the flowing water did its sorting. At the edge of town, there were all these ticos in a pile of mud at the edge of town. The little cars got carried down. Okay, so water is very effective in sorting things, and I would say these organisms are sorted by flowing water and then rapidly buried. So these pictures I'm showing, these are small samples of what are actually huge accumulations, very extensive. You know, you see these things, all these displays there at the fossil show, and a lot of them go out with people who buy them every year. The next year they got more. I mean, these are just enormous assemblages, this kind of thing. These, what are those called? Anyway, pardon? Nautiloids, yeah. And you find just a lot of these kind of things. This must be a huge area covered with these things. And they're oriented pretty much in one direction, which means they were brought in here by flowing water. They were not living there. And just a huge assemblages of these things. The fish up there, Green River. This is again, it covers a very large area, and you have these fish, typically like this. These, I'm not sure if they're squid or something else. Soft-bodied creatures in a mass death assemblage. And there are just so many of these kinds of things there. Overload you with some more data. Here are more. Various kinds of trilobites. These are small ones. There are also big assemblages of big ones. Starfish. Crinoids. These are small. This is from our office. These are small ammonites. Again, huge assemblage of these ammonites are there. And so, I can't emphasize enough how enormous, interesting these fossils displays are. If you haven't been to Tucson, you need to go. So what's the explanation for the fossil record? Well, one explanation, the usual one, death and burial by normal processes. No, can't be. Wildebeests are gone in 7 years. Whale carcasses in a few years. They just disappear. They don't hang around to be buried. And if you figure, what's the average sedimentation in a lot of these formations? Well, I figured out in a Bridger formation, which I studied in Wyoming, Eocene Bridger formation. If you take the radiometric dates, the limestone, the periodic limestones, are be 1 every 200,000 years. Okay, you calculate that's about that much sediment per year on the average. And yet it's got, it's full of beautiful fossils, turtles especially. That much it would take, I don't know how many years to bury a little turtle. 130 years, I think I figured. Okay, so that one doesn't work. Another one, preserved by anoxic water. So the animals are in water with no oxygen, and so you don't have decay. And you still see this being used by paleontologists at times. But back between 1986 to 2012, there are several sets of experiments that were done to test this theory. And they all found the same thing. Whether there's oxygen in the water or no, does not make a significant difference in the rate of decay. Well, oxygen doesn't matter. And why would that be? Because when I die, the decay is going to start from bacteria that are already in my body. And that's the way it is, typically. And those are anaerobic bacteria. They don't use oxygen. So it really doesn't matter whether you're in anoxic water or not. The decay is the same. It goes very fast. We studied those whales, and we concluded that they must have been buried very rapidly. And we actually published a paper saying that right out. And then our reviewers were top level taphonomists, world record expert taxonomists. Taphonomy is the study of how fossils get formed. And in fact, one of those reviewers, Anna K. Behrensmeyer, I had a chance to talk with her about my research for an hour and a half once. And she completely agreed that we were right. They had to have been buried rapidly. Because people like her, these taphonomists, they understand what it takes to preserve something. And anoxic water, it doesn't matter. It isn't going to be effective. Okay, so we published that. After we finished our research, we studied hundreds of these whales, literally. There's a group from Europe, some Italian paleontologists and others that they had with them. They had 20 or 30 people in their research covering the same area that we had studied. And they knew about our research. They knew what we'd done. They had our papers. And they actually, one of the reasons we quit working there is we're trying to do something, and you got 20 or 30 people combing in the area, and how can we compete with them? But anyway, so they wrote a big paper, and they did not like our idea that you have to bury these rapidly, because of course they don't think that way. They think in millions of years. And so they came up with an explanation of how these whales got preserved. And they had, I think, three processes they suggested. One is low oxygen level. Well, we already know that doesn't work. That doesn't help. Especially when the sediments there with these whales have a lot of evidence of very rapid processes. Storm currents. So that's something not going to work. The other thing they suggested is as the whales are laying there on the bottom of the ocean, shallow ocean it would be at that place, the current will kind of carve out below their bodies. You stand in the sand, the waves come in, it takes out sand from under your feet. Well, okay, so they would partially bury the whale, and that would help. Well, we've seen evidence of that. These whales have been sort of undercut by currents. But that one doesn't work. And they should know better. Because what happens is if an animal is partly buried, the part that's covered will last longer than the part that's exposed. Well, the whales simply don't show that kind of evidence. They're all preserved the same. So that one doesn't work. I don't remember what the third one was, but it didn't work either. So they're...
They actually misquoted by physics when they were working on that second thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so they look at the rocks and they see a certain thing. They see long ages of time going by, and that's the way they want it to be. And they don't like somebody questioning that. But they come up with explanations that don't work. It fits their way of thinking, but they don't work if you're honest with it. And I don't think they're dishonest or dumb, but they're just misguided by a false view of Earth history. Okay, so anoxic water. No, experiments show that anoxic water does not slow decay. Does not stop it, doesn't even slow it. There really is no alternative to rapid catastrophic burial. And how rapid? I think we really have no idea yet. I mean, most of this fossil record is in a year. Okay, and how, even with the ones I'm showing you, they're so well preserved. Yeah, you bury them quickly to stop decay, but we don't really understand what it takes to do that. Why does just burying them stop decay? And there's a lot more to learn about this. Dr. Phillips has some ideas for some experiments to do. Maybe it takes the pressure of all this accumulation on top of them. That's just one idea. It takes something to stop that decay, to get the kind of fossils that I've been showing you. But yet there is this part of the fossil record that are disarticulated, just isolated bones. The Dino Dig, this big dinosaur quarry in Wyoming run by Adventist paleontologists from Texas. If you haven't been there, you need to go there some summer. Anyway, they have untold thousands of dinosaur bones. These are all disarticulated. Okay, so these are separate bones, but you look at those bones, the quality of preservation is just the same as for all the others. They're beautifully preserved. You don't find the evidence of things that would happen if they lay there for a long time. They had to be buried very rapid. So even those disarticulated fossils are very well preserved. They don't show the disintegration that you would see here. They don't show the disintegration that you would see in the wildebeest bones. And paleontologists who dig up these dinosaurs, for instance, they will state at times that when you first uncover these things, there is a smell of death. Okay, I mean this is amazing preservation. The smell of death is still there. I was talking with a science teacher at Union College, and she said, well, she grew up in Montana, and one time she and her dad were at a restaurant, and there was a group of men, obviously sort of workers there, and they were angry about something. Her dad went and talked to them to asked them what is the problem, what are you angry about? Well, they were working on a construction project there in Montana. They're doing the digging and the preparation for, I think, some kind of a jail, that was going to be put there out in the prairies. And they were digging into the ground, and they were breaking up big bones. I would guess that they were dinosaurs. They didn't say, but probably dinosaur bones. And they were angry for two things. One, their instructions were dig them up and destroy them and bury them. They were pretty sure that was illegal. I'm sure it was. The other thing that bothered them, they dug into this big quarry full of bones, and the smell of death was just amazing, they said. They were worried that this was going to affect their own health. It was that strong. Okay, so they've been buried for, several thousand years, but still the smell of death, it's just still there. Amazing preservation of these things. Okay, and that excellent preservation is not just for big bones. Even small bones are excellently preserved. I have a few here. This little amphibian, a few centimeters long, perfectly preserved, every bone in place. The middle there, you have a feather from the Green River Formation and a turtle bone from the Bridger. I wish I had some pictures of typical small bones. I don't. I need to go to a museum and get some pictures of those. But you dig up like little rodent bones and that sort of thing. They're mostly collecting by what we call screen washing. You take masses of the sediment. These rocks that these are in, typically they're not like usual rocks. They dissolve in water. They put them in water, dissolve it, run them through a screen to collect the little bones. And these little rodent bones, they're like the dinosaur bones and other things I showed you. They're not disintegrating. They're not being destroyed by scavengers or by decay. They're just beautiful little bones. I need to get a lot more pictures of those. See this little cricket? A little over a centimeter long. Beautiful. So all these bones, how do they get preserved? You just don't find this physical or chemical disintegration. So there are so many fossils, and they are just amazing, from soft-bodied animals to ones with bones, preserved, all preserved. And again, you have to look at these enough to really be impressed with the quality of this preservation. In the modern world, animals almost never get fossilized. It takes very unusual situations like the La Brea tar pits to preserve fossils today. Fossils are only formed during catastrophes. That seems clear to me. Only when they're quickly buried and preserved. And typical paleontologists do not accept this. And why don't they? They see what the bones are like. And they're not dumb. But it's like this. If I know that this took eons of time to do all this, when I say I know, I mean that is so firmly fixed in my mind that I would not consider any other option. If that's my state of mind, I'm not going to notice these things that I've been showing you. Because all the evidence has to be interpreted to fit what I know is right. So assumptions, presuppositions, your worldview has a very strong effect on your mind, on how we understand things. And the idea that this simply don't fit the geologic record is that isn't usually recognized at all. And so they interpret things according to what they understand. But even these modern catastrophes are not adequate to do the job. So what does it take? Well, I will submit to you, I think the only catastrophe that can explain the fossil record is the one you read about in the Bible. And who would accept this out there in the scientific world? It just, it'd blow their minds that I would even suggest this. But I believe that's the only answer that can explain the kind of things I've shown you. So, it takes something more than a normal catastrophe. The biblical flood put down the geologic record in a year. It takes that kind of thing to make fossils like we see all through the fossil record.